Hi, everyone. Welcome to lecture number 5. So, this lecture, in a way, doesn't introduce that much new material, but what it does, it brings together what we've been talking about really ever since the Epic of Gilgamesh, at least talking about in one particular way, which is dualism in the West. This view that there is, both in Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman traditions and even before, that the nature that we know, the world that we know, and to the Greeks it was physis itself, nature, their word for nature. This is not the real world, according to Plato, and the way that Plato and Aristotle and everyone after basically revised the tradition, in that the world that we know, everything that you know through sense experience, is not the real world. There's another world, and that metaphysical world, whether it's the realm of ideas in Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and everyone else, or in Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of heaven. And that's the real world. And setting up that kind of dichotomy, it makes us, sort of look at nature in a different kind of way, as sort of an inferior copy. And that's pretty much Plato's exact word, an inferior copy of the true world. So let's jump right into this, and you can see what we're talking about. And the prezi we have today is a little different than usual. And I'll show you what I mean. It's down here, number 5. And you'll see, instead of having that traditional way that we've set it up, there's this line across here. And I'll explain what that is in a moment and how that works. But first, regarding what this is here, we're doing eco-criticism, eco-theology, and eco-philosophy. And again, this sort of is what we've been doing right along. So what I mean by that is eco-criticism right along, because that's what we're doing in this class. We interpret texts and how to understand them. But eco-theology is what we did when we hit Christianity, and even before with the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And that's the way that religion impacts the way that we view the world. And then, of course, eco-philosophy we did with Plato. So we're going to see those all brought together here in this lecture. So let's start right in with dualism in the West. So in terms of technological modernity, the argument put forth by Heidegger and augmented by his student Hannah Arendt, we can return to surveying dualism in the West. So from Gilgamesh forward through the Greeks, but then the way that it has this impact in Western thinking. So let's jump ahead to that. The main idea here, right, I call it the overarching idea here, is that dualism has existed in the West for 5,000 years on a variety of registers. We're going to look at those, such as place, deity, time, etc. All this is dualistically thought of in the West. And most of these, manifestations, the metaphysical is privileged at the cost of marginalizing the physical. So that's why it matters to us. I mean, you can see why this would be an interesting discussion to have philosophically or theologically in its own right. But what does this mean about the way that we think of the earth and nature itself? Do we think of it as, the best possible place? Well, in the Western tradition, it has not been the best possible place. It's seen as, again, the sort of inferior thing. So we'll get to that in more detail in a moment. Yeah. If we think about what Heidegger said about how this preference toward constant presence is enacted on a massive scale, and I would argue that you can see the fossil fuel economy that we have, or just more simply adopting fossil fuels the way we had the last 200 or 400 years, you can see that sort of propensity for wanting a fixed presence all the time, being now cornerstone of the way our culture works with respect to power and energy. So we'll get into that as we go through here, but it's why it's important, because it's not just this sort of underlying thinking that has followed us through Western culture, which it is, at least for 2,000 or 3,000 years, but more than that, it's actually sort of being enacted, according to Heidegger, and we'll look at that. So the dualism, and by that I mean here it's simple, right? Dual, two, and on the one hand the physical, on the other hand the metaphysical. You think of them as a dyad, or a binary structure, and one that's in opposition. These two are definitely opposed to each other in this way of thinking. So first off, we're fortified with the understanding of how the Greeks, understood nature by way of Andy Goldsworthy, and that is that it's constantly in flux, ever changing, ever moving, like a rose, in the process of being born, coming into being, coming out of being, and going away. So that's the way nature works according to the Greeks, and Andy Goldsworthy's installations often work that way. Plato, however, radically reimagines this, Plato and Socrates, and they argue that the only true nature is nature that can never change. We don't have access to that. I guess Socrates would argue that if you spend enough time, like 35 years, when you get to that point in your life, having studied this, you could access that realm intellectually. But we really don't have access to it. We have access to the world, what we think of as the real world, although it's not what Socrates thought of as the real world. And the world around us, the real world that we access through our senses and all, is always changing. There's nothing that exists beyond that. So we can, and what we'll do today is to pull this all together, and that's the relationship between the physical, and that's the realm of physis, ever changing, and the metaphysical, that's the realm that never changes, whether it's Plato's realm of the ideas or the Judeo-Christian notion of heaven. So what we're going to do now is recap all this, and it's kind of a second pass at the material in a way, but in another way, we can only sort of introduce this material now because we understand how everything's working. Now that you understand how it's all working, let's pull it all together and see what it says about the relationship that we have in the West to nature, to the world that we encounter. So let's go down here, and each of these is going to be a specific register, and they're going to show up basically as slides. So let me just jump in and do the first one here. So there's going to be a line that's going to run all the way across, and up here is going to be the metaphysical, metaphysis. Down here is going to be the physical, and this is going to continue everywhere. And this is the first one, and this is just a general thing. And then we're going to get to specific things like deity and time and all. So what's up here? Well, it's what's beyond the physical realm, beyond earth, beyond nature, beyond change, things that never change. So what's up here? Well, the Judeo-Christian God is up here. This is not a God like Humbaba who's, out in the world changing and all. This God never changes. He is in a change-free realm. And that particular realm is known generally as heaven, at least in Christian thinking. Jewish thinking is a little different. Islamic thinking is a little different, but we're basically all familiar with the notion of heaven in a general way. So that's what's up there. In terms of Plato's realm of the ideas is up here. These are things that never change. The idea of Plato, of, say, justice, it never changes, or beauty never changes. What's down here then, the bottom end of the thing, that's nature in the Greek sense of process. In other words, things that change. Everything that we know changes, even though a mountain may not look like it's changing. In a larger geological register, it does change over millions of years or so. The universe is changing, right? We have an expanding universe at this point. So everything changes. It's also a way of thinking about it. And Plato was well aware of this. Plato spent a lot of time with this. It's what you experience by way of sense experience. This is what you can see, what you can hear, smell, touch. This is, the world that we encounter. It is not something that you close your eyes and imagine, the way you would do the realm of Platonic ideas. So it's down here. Plants are down there, animals, human beings, the earth, everything physical is down there. Human beings are a little special, and we're actually going to do a slide on those. So that's the general idea. And again, now you can see how it works. That line is going to go all the way through, and we have up here the metaphysical and here the physical. So let's do the next one. So let's talk about deities. We've had this before, but let's go over it. So what's up here? Metaphysical deities that exist beyond the earth. These are not living here on the earth, spending their time on the earth, like Humbaba and local deities of place, genus Loki. So Shamash is an early version of this, right? Because Shamash is separate from the earth. He's the sun god. He's up there outside of the earth, separate and apart from the earth. But the Judeo-Christian God is probably the best example, certainly the best example in Western culture, because, this God, Jehovah or Adonai or whatever name he's taking, he created everything, right? He's separate and apart from the creation, and he's in another realm altogether. Now, I know some of you might say, but that's not the way I imagine Christianity, that God is actually here incarnate in everything. That is an interpretation of Christianity. It is a relatively recent one. Arguably, it doesn't really come on the scene until the 17th century in the West. For most part, through most of Western history, God is imagined as separate and apart. And we're actually going to look at the emergence of that idea of when God becomes, incarnate here in the world. But, the very notion of that Christ comes to be and walk in the world as a human being, that God actually becomes incarnate as Christ so that he can be a human being. That's kind of a giveaway that the underlying thinking is that God wasn't really here in the same way. Again, all this is open for interpretation, and we live in a more modern era, but for most of Western history, God has been separate in this other realm. But we'll talk about that as the course goes on. So in terms of deity, what's down here? Well, these are earth gods that are moored to the earth. And these are gods that are not transcendental, that are not metaphysical, that they're thoroughly physical. Genus Loki figures like Humbaba are certainly, gods of this sort. So are most ancient gods. I know that the goddess figures of Persephone, Demeter, and Hecate, I talked about that, how there may have been this sort of earlier matriarchal religion where you had a three-part trinity god, which was Persephone, who's known as the girl or the prepubescent woman, Demeter, who is the matron, who is capable of bearing children, and then, after that age becomes Hecate. And three-part together, they form a deity of the earth. It's very much, part of the earth. And when you think about it, it's very much involved in those sort of life cycles of the earth, right? This is not, a God that is separate from change. That God is right in the middle of change, right? The process of birth is what's sort of incarnate there. So that's different than the Judeo-Christian God too. Most deities across the planet are down here. Christianity is different with the deity up here. There are other religions like this, of course, but Christianity is the one, of course, that impacts the West the most. So going from deity, let's jump into place. So how does this work? What is a place that is beyond the physical? That's the Judeo-Christian heaven, Plato's realm of the ideas. They're imagined as, in terms of, we've had this locus amenus, a pleasant place. They are the most pleasant of all places. They are so pleasant that they're, they're on a whole different level than the places on earth. So in other words, the most beautiful, bucolic place you can imagine, some wonderful park full of flowers or whatever. As wonderful as that may be, it's got nothing on these places. These places are imagined as being superior and far superior. Yeah. They are not anywhere that you can go to when you're alive. I'll talk about Plato in a moment, but in terms of Christianity, no one gets to heaven while you're alive. You have to go through death to get to heaven. That's how Jesus gets to heaven. That's how he becomes the Christ, the Savior. To get to heaven, you have to go through him to get there. It's not some place that anyone has access to. Plato argues again that you can have access to this sort of intellectually while you're alive, but it's clearly, in these terms, a placeless place. And in other words, there's no place that you can go to visit here. So in terms of place, what's down here, the earth is increasingly seen because of this as an inferior, imperfect place and not a locus amenus. So even though we have this long tradition in pastoral poetry, which we're going to get to, of, there being these perfect bucolic places where, shepherds walk around with their sheep and weather's always perfect, there's always abundant food provided by the earth. That may seem like a perfect place, but with this version of thinking, those are no longer perfect places. So in the traditional view, and this will change, and I'll talk about that directly, but in the traditional view, say Yosemite, you might think, well, that's probably the most beautiful place you can imagine, parts of it. Well, yeah, but in this view, it's not the pinnacle of a perfect place at all. It's an inferior realm. Might be a nice part of the inferior realm, but it's definitely part of the inferior realm. And that's a problem, because if you're trying to ensure that a place like Yosemite is preserved, which of course happens with early conservationists like John Muir, then you really want to get people thinking that it's something pretty special, something kind of perfect in its own right. You don't want them to think, well, this is just an inferior realm. I mean, why are we spending much time thinking about this? We should be thinking more about heaven and getting into heaven and all, rather than succumbing to the pleasures of the flesh. And it would, in the most radical thinking, be seen that way. And what I mean by that is, if you just sort of get overwhelmed with something like Yosemite and you fall in love with it and you start cherishing it, are you really valuing the important things, which are the realm beyond this, the values beyond that? That will change with someone like John Muir, which is why I brought him up here, because Muir, and we're going to see, Muir comes after Henry David Thoreau, the end of the 19th century. He's not that far from us, which is why we share many of his same values. Muir will argue, and remember I mentioned that coming out of the 17th century, people began to think that God was actually here on earth, something that didn't happen, or happened very little prior to that in the Western tradition. Muir will actually say that God is in Yosemite, and specifically Yosemite. He visits Yosemite, and actually when they plan to build a dam there to supply water to San Francisco, Muir, strikes out at those people and calls them, desecrators of a sacrilegious site. He thinks that, Yosemite is so perfect that it's actually sacred, that it's actually where God lives. If you were to destroy that, if you were to build that dam, which they did, but if you were to build that, you would actually be doing something that was sacrilegious, because you would be harming the home of God. That's new thinking. And you can see why Muir, he's in a tradition where that makes sense, but you could see why he rolls it out there, because he's actually saying this place is not an inferior realm. This place is very special. This place is sacred. This place is the home of God. And that's a great innovation. It's a great innovation in Christian thinking in a way. And again, it's been brewing for more than a couple hundred years before that. But it allows what had previously been an inferior place to be preserved and taken care of. And Muir is obviously a major figure in the early conservation movement in the United States. So that's place. Let's jump to the next one, which is time. So how does this work? And we've had this as early as like Andy Goldsworthy. Up here is a changeless realm, right? Where, things just are always as they are. They're immortal, they're perfect, and they're unchanged. So the Judeo, Christian God in heaven, Platonic ideas and all. The important thing here is not just that they're up in another realm, as we were talking about for the last few slides, but time is locked in here. Nothing changes here. And that's important because nothing decays there, right? So you'll hear the phrase often with Christianity, you hear it a lot, the immortal soul. What that means is that when you're, and again, in dualistic thinking, we're going to get to how that works with people in just a moment. But if your soul pops out of the body and it goes and is in heaven with God, you don't decay then. You don't have to worry about old age and, and having sore joints and all that. Everything there is not subject to change. You just are and always will be. And that can be, an enticing proposition if you're worried about dying and you're worried about decaying and all, that there you're locked in. And often in Christian thinking, it's imagined that you sort of get transported back to sort of the height of your physicalness, right? So even if you die at 90 years old and you're sort of, you have trouble walking around, you can't see very well or whatever, you get, the clock gets turned back and you're your youthful self again, and you're that way forever. You do not have to worry about the ravages of time. So what's down here? Well, this is Heraclitus's realm. In Greek, the word is gignomai, which means becoming or emerging into being. So what's down here? Birth, life, death, the endless bringing forth and passing away of phusis, right? Andy Goldsworthy's installations are an example. So is a blossoming rose, a streaming stream, Heraclitus's example, or human life. So nothing down here, nothing here changes up here. Everything down here changes. That's what distinguishes these two, not in terms of place, like, heaven or earth or whatever, but in terms of change. Changeless realm, a realm down here characterized by change. That is the one thing about it in terms of time that makes it what it is, that everything here is subject to the ravages of time. The only way that you can, get out of that and get freed of that, there's only one entity in the universe in this thinking, or certainly on earth, that can do it, and that is human beings, and only part of a human being, the human soul, is able to make the jump from here to there and get free of that and have, the immortal soul as eternal life. That's the promise of Christianity. And we're going to talk about why that's an appealing promise as we continue with Western thinking along the way. But anyhow, that's how this works with respect to time. So we'll jump to the next one here, which is us, human beings, dualistic human beings. I note that we are half up here and half down here. We're unique in that we straddle this line. And that's an important way of giving us access to what's up here. So let's talk about what's up here. This is the realm of the soul. So just to put it quickly, you have a soul and you have a body. That's how human beings are dualistic. The body's down here, the soul is up here. You'll hear this called different things. It will be called the mind in later thinking. And this is coming out of Christian thinking, but thinking here like with Descartes, and we're like in the 17th century, and people are going to shy away from talking about the soul in a religious sense, and they're trying to work this out in like a scientific, philosophical sense, even though they're still more, still caught up in this dualistic thinking. And we're going to start talking about the mind there. So instead of body-soul dualism, you're going to have mind-body. It's actually, when this is referred to as the soul up here, sometimes it's called the body down here, but on note, it's often called flesh. So it's like spirit-flesh duality or mind-body duality. Same basic idea. But the thing to know here is that this is the best part of the human being, if not, in fact, and is generally referred to as the true human being. So you have these two parts. They can often be at war, and they certainly are not the same. And the soul is true person, and it has to be, right? Because if you die and your soul pops out of your body and you go to heaven, well, the body can't follow you generally in the way of this thinking. Again, Christianity is complicated with a long history and lots of different flavors, and some the body can, but for the most part, no. So then if the body gets left behind, it's not like part of you is left behind. The only part of you that really matters, the soul, this sort of, non-physical thing, goes up to heaven. So that's the true person. Otherwise, you would only be half a person when you got to heaven. But no, that's the one true, real person. So the body will pass away, but the metaphysical soul lives eternally, or at least has the potential for it. Actually, in most Christian thinking, it does get to live eternally, except remember there's not just hell, but not just heaven, but there's this other metaphysical realm, hell, which is also something not here. And there, the soul can continue on there, but of course you don't want to wind up there. You want to be up in heaven. So metaphysical thinkers, as a consequence, generally privilege the soul and marginalize the body. Soul is good. The body is bad. I'll talk about how it's bad in a moment. But this is the same, right? Because, we have this line going through everything here. This is the same as, the body here is marginalized. The soul is privileged in the same way that the planet Earth is marginalized and the metaphysical realm, heaven, is privileged. So what's down here? This is the realm of the body, right? So often in Christian thinking, and has different words, obviously, with different languages, but it's the flesh. And, the flesh is often seen as inferior, both by, Christian thinkers and Plato as well. Plato would have a little more nuanced version because the flesh can take you to the realm of the soul and of mind. And in fact, in the Symposium, which is a great dialogue on love, Socrates argues that's how it works. But ultimately, the flesh gets left behind. The problem here is not only is the soul superior to the body, but the body is actually seen as a liability and a problem, and is, put it simply, inferior, because it's often believed to be a source of temptation, such as like sexual temptation or having appetites like for food or whatever, and the source of sin and ultimately evil. So what does that mean? Well, okay, you're a dualistic human being. Your soul is gravitating towards the good things, right? To be with God, to be free of the flesh. But the body is constantly sort of pulling your soul down, giving you temptations of the flesh, usually what they're called. Sex is the classic one, right? So sex is not something that generally in this thinking plays much to do with the soul. But the body, we're like animals, right? The body is similar to animals, and we want to have sex and do things like that. But the soul should try to command the body not to do that. But there's this tension, right? So this phrase coming out of the New Testament, Christ says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The spirit might want to sort of pull away from those temptations, but ultimately succumbs to them. When it succumbs to those temptations of the flesh, that's sin. and that is giving in to evil. So here you have a problem, right? Because this physical realm, the realm of nature and everything that we're around, it's not only, inferior in the sense of the way Plato calls it, an inferior copy to the next realm, but it's actually a temptation to evil. It is trying to pull you into evil. And again, that's a problem if you want to have a good relationship with the planet. It doesn't mean that this doesn't get worked out in later Christian thinking, but for broad swath of Christian thinking, this is it. The physical realm is a temptation realm, an inferior realm. So that's us dualistic human beings. So let's talk about Plato in a moment, because he has a little twist on things here. And he has a divided line that goes across here. And, reason is up here in the intelligible realm of ideas. And down here is just opinion and the sensory realm. So what does that mean? Well, let me explain. Up here is the intelligible realm where ideas are known by way of reason. Plato's word in ancient Greek for that is nous, reason. So what does that mean? Well, everything you know up here, you get to by way of reason. Nice, cool, detached reason. You're able to reason through how the world works. In fact, that's what Plato and Socrates, that's their claim to fame, that they were able to reason through how the universe worked, just by reason. And for hundreds and years, thousands of years, there was sort of the gold standard of that. I think it's pretty clear right now, though, that they really didn't have much of a clue at all about how the world worked. And Aristotle, so Socrates is the teacher of Plato, and then Plato is the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle has vast tracts on how everything works from de anima to human nature to nature itself. And it's all pretty much wrong. Even though through much of history, Western history, he was known as the philosopher, the guy that had all the answers, even though they're wrong. But anyhow, reason gets you there. It's nothing to do with the flesh or anything like that, nothing to do with desires or anything. And this intelligible realm, and this is a realm marked by intelligence that you can just reason through, is, of course, Plato's true reality. The nature we sense is illusory. This realm is, and this is a difference between Plato and Aristotle and Greek thinking and Judeo-Christian thinking, it is accessible to human beings by virtue of reason. So if you can understand, so how do you understand true justice? Well, first you have to look at a whole bunch of examples of justice in the world or beauty in the world. And then through reason, you can reason through and say, why is this just? Why is that just? Why isn't that just? And if you think about it enough, you will then come with an overarching, I want to say definition, and that kind of fits the thing here, the way Plato understands it through. This is all, his whole theory is about language, his word for it is logos. But you'll come up with the definition of, or let's just say an understanding. He wouldn't like that word, but let's just say an understanding of justice because you've thought about it so much. It's entirely something that you have access through being a very careful, reasonable thinker. And that's how you know what justice is. It's not something that's intuitive. You just know by being out in the world. You have to think about this a lot. And if you think about it enough, you'll say, I know what it is that makes everything just. There's something about that. There's one thing that his word is in Greek, it partakes of. And that's the idea of the eide of justice. The idea, our word idea comes from, eide and idea are the same in Greek. They just take different forms. So our idea of justice comes from that. That's just thinking it through and being able to say that you know that intellectually. Anyhow, down here, the sensory realm of earth and physis, and that's nature, and you know from the Abernathy reading, like Plato's cave, is an illusory appearance, a deception, an inferior copy. That is Plato's word, it's a copy. Plato startlingly deconstructs reality as the real world of nature, change, and life is found to be nothing more than an illusion. So everything that you know, everything that we've encountered, everything that you would encounter in the world, everything that most human beings have encountered in the world and other traditions is wrong. It's an illusion. It's a cheap copy. So in this sense, what is nature? True nature is metaphysical. The earth and physis are an illusion. And that is a remarkable deconstruction. It's arguably the first great deconstruction of Western thinking. And when the first deconstructive modern thinkers come on the scene, like Heidegger and Section 100 of Being and Time, Heidegger talks about this in particular, and that will impact people who read Heidegger carefully, like Jacques Derrida. So this is the original deconstruction in the West, and it's a doozy because it is taking the world that we know, everything that we know and value, and saying, yeah, it's inferior. It's not the real thing. The real thing is something that you can only get at through reason. All this sense stuff, all the body stuff, the desires of the body, everything related to the body is inferior. And that's a remarkable deconstruction, right? Because it sort of pulls the rug out from under us because, you might have a great encounter with the world, know a lot about the world. You might be a farmer and know a great deal about the place where you live and think, well, I have, knowledge of reality. It plays out in the way that I do my farming. To Plato, that's even not. He doesn't even want to call that knowledge, which is why I note here it's known here as just doxa, which is the Greek for opinion. It's kind of a confusing word in the modern sense, but what he means is it's not real knowledge. It's an inferior kind of knowing your way around, but it's not deep knowledge. So that sets off an enormous tradition in the West of not valuing what's down here much at all. So let's get to the next one. Presence and absence. So I introduced this, I believe, with Heidegger, and it's worth noting here. So much of Western philosophy after Plato has been a quest for constant presence. And that would be, things that are ever present. So what are examples? Truth, beauty, God, so forth. All the things we've been talking about up here. But these are things that are present in the sense that they are always present. They never go away. They're never absent at all because, truth is always there. If truth suddenly went away for a while in the metaphysical realm, this would be a problem because there'd be no mooring point for truth in the world. So it has to be there, present. So these have different names. Idea is Plato's word. Substantia is Aristotle's word. Subjectivité in French, Descartes. Absolute spirit, Hegel in German would be Geist. Nietzsche, the will to power, the Willzermacht, again in German. Presentia would be Heidegger, borrowing from the Presentia would be Latin. All these words, and Derrida as well, all these words, all these different flavors of it, they're all the same basic idea, this belief in constant presence, or more simply, as it's generally referred to, and this will be by Heidegger and Derrida and that gang, presence, the thing that is always present, always there. That becomes incredibly important in Western philosophy, in Western thinking, and basically in Western life is the way it plays out, even with ordinary people and the way they comport themselves daily and especially in respect to the world around them. So what's the flip side? And that's absence. So these two are really a binary structure. They're two parts of sort of a whole, and it is the opposite side. So phusis is the play of absence and presence. It's the endless temporal process of emerging and falling away. It's the rose that doesn't exist, wonderfully exist in a blooming form, and then falls away. Stream Heraclitus' example, which Heidegger picks up on, sort of riffs on, it's always streaming. Sometimes, it fails to stream during a drought. Other times, it's hardly a stream at all when it's a flood, overabundance. So, what is is present is the present, and what is present will soon be absent. So what do I mean by that? Well, a perfect blooming rose, or one of Andy Goldsworth's installations at the moment it's finished, are perfect. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. You just sort of are overwhelmed by that. But because we're down here and this end of this part of things, that's going to go away, and the rose very quickly is going to go away. So if you ever have, beautiful rose or roses you put in a vase on your table, that's great. It's wonderful, but leave it there, and as the days go by, it suddenly falls, and the petals fall and all, and it's done. That's the condition of nature, right? That's the thing. So it's always an endless play of absence and presence. It's great because there'll be new roses, if not this year, then next year, and it always continues. But it's not like there's consistently, one enduring rose. It is always a play of absence and presence, just like human life. We're here and then we're gone. Human life continues. Human life has continued for thousands of years, but not our lives. Our lives, you'll be lucky if you get 100 years. And then we are present, and then we are absent. So sort of a play on words here. What is present, and by that I mean here, in this space, right now, is the present. So not in terms of space, but temporality. It's the present moment, the now, which is a present, and by that I say a gift of the moment that will soon be absent. So what is present is the present, which is a present that will soon be absent. So what do I mean by all this? It means that what is present now here in this place is that moment of presence. So let's talk about the rose. What is present here on the table is the rose. At this moment, it is entirely present as a rose, and we normally mean that when we think of a rose in Western thinking anyhow, as that perfect blossom. So that's the present there. That's the moment of time. But the good thing about this, and people will argue for it, and certainly Andy Goldsworthy will, and in other traditions like, say, Buddhism, it's everything. That's the gift of the moment. And what I mean by that is that's the present, and present in the sense of gift, like you give presents at someone's birthday. Because that moment when the rose is there, that's a wonderful present. That's a wonderful gift. We should enjoy it. We should appreciate it. We should be in that moment as much as we possibly can to be there, knowing that it's going to fade away, but not worrying about that. That's sort of having the future intrude upon us and cause trouble. The ideal thing, and again, in like Buddhism, the argument is be in the present, be in that moment all the time, so that you can just fully enjoy everything, whether it's a blossoming rose, a smile on a child, a beautiful sunrise. These are things that won't endure, so be there for them. Be there to receive that gift, that present. So you can see how a whole philosophy could be built up about what's going on down here, and others have. And again, we're not talking about Buddhism in this course, but if we were, we could talk an awful lot about what's going on down here, because that would be, the religion is set up to celebrate that. It's to celebrate temporality, but not the Western tradition. The Western tradition has been about what's up here, not about the play of absence and presence, that sort of endless cycle of coming into and out of existence, but rather the notion that there is somehow a realm free of temporality, free of time, a changeless realm where none of this can impact us. So So this interestingly plays out with artifacts too. You wouldn't think this would, right? So before I get into it, what I mean by that is if this is a true metaphysical realm that we're talking about, well, everything down here is going to change. Things that you may not think they're going to change, they're going to change. You build a massive stone temple that might look like it's, not in this realm that it's going to endure. And in terms of human life, it may endure many generations, but it's going to change too. But how does this work then? Well, remember, Gilgamesh sought to gain immortality. And if you remember those opening lines, which I read from the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was his claim to fame. That's what he hoped would do it. He was going to rebuild the city of Uruk, right? The greatest city that had ever been known in the West. He was going to make it bigger and better than anyone could possibly imagine. He needed resources to do that, hence cutting down the cedar forest. But the idea was this was going to be a testament to Gilgamesh that would endure for many generations anyhow. All sorts of human constructions have been built that way. So temples, I know cities, many artifacts attempt, but ultimately fail to resist phusis. So many things are built to give the impression that they are, if not immortal, that they are rock solid, usually built out of some kind of rock to do that. And they're rock solid that they're going to endure. And that sends a real message because whatever it is, the institution or whatever that is represented is imagined as going to last for maybe not eternity, clearly not, but for a long time. So the pyramids, right, or the Sphinx, these are things that were meant to last for thousands of years. They have. They're in a state of decay now, and they were in a state of decay pretty quickly when the nice smooth stones covering them were taken off. But the idea is it's meant to give that impression. State buildings are usually made that way. So you go to Washington, D.C., and you see all these buildings, whether it's Congress or whatever, and these are massive stone structures. Why? Well, it's to say this country is going to last. We are built for the long haul here. These are like the pyramids. They're going to endure over time. And they have, and they no doubt will for some time anyhow. Corporate centers are designed to work that way, like the World Trade Center. Why are these massive? In modern times, we don't use rocks as much as we use like steel and iron and glass and all for that. And it's meant to say, well, this is going to endure for a long time, which of course is why symbolically, when the World Trade Center was, attacked during 9/11, that was, I think, had to be in the back of the minds of the people who initiated that, was that it was a way of showing, yes, you've created something that looks like it's going to endure for a long time. We're going to show you that this is not going to endure. We're going to collapse it right now. Or we're going to, symbolically collapse it. And I think the notion was this will be the beginning and the end of it. That was the sort of message that was being said. So it's really, in this sense of artifacts, anything made by a culture that endures material things for a long period of time. Some tools can do that, but especially materials like marble and granite and things built out of that are designed to signal that they are, if not truly metaphysical, that they are out of the human realm, in the sense of out of the human time frame. What I mean by that, out of the 100-year cycle of a human lifetime, that these transcend that for long periods of time. In the West, and if you think about so many things in the West, like in the Greek culture, ever since then, there's been a desire to do this. Roman culture certainly picked it up. Not so much carved out of rock in their case as made out of cement, which is this sort of, a moldable rock. But certainly it's been a cornerstone of so much of Western artifact making. But down here, I'll give you an example from Japan's Jinju Shrine. This is a series of wood structures, and they're accepted as being in a state of constant decay. And every 20 years, these have been rebuilt since the 7th century. And it makes a striking contrast, I argue, to the pyramids in Greek temples. So what's going on here? Well, instead of trying to make something like the pyramids or the Parthenon or something that would endure for many centuries out of, like rock material, in this approach, the world is accepted as being caught in flux. Everything is constantly changing. Nonetheless, they want to make a temple that will endure over time. So every 20 years, they rebuild this temple out of cedar. And it lasts pretty well, and cedars are very good wood to build with as far as not decaying. So it lasts fine for 20 years, but then before it starts to decay too much, it is completely dismantled and rebuilt again, entirely new out of entirely new wood. But if you were to go there from 1 year and then go there 5 years later, you might assume that the temple was exactly the same. If you visited it 50 years later, from when you were a child or something, you might assume it's exactly the same temple. Well, it is conceptually, but it's actually been, in that case, rebuilt 2 or 3 times since. So it's an acknowledgement that change is always happening, but it's trying to find a strain of continuity through it. So it's an intriguing idea. But definitely what's down here are things like food, clothing, and pretty much everything in the human realm is down here, because everything in the human realm changes over time. It's been argued, by the way, kind of an aside in terms of 21st century culture, in terms of consumer culture, that 99% of what you buy is gone within 6 months, that it has served its usefulness. You can imagine that certainly with food, but even things like clothing don't last long. We buy things that don't last very long in our world. We are in a world, we clearly, even though we might sort of have a predilection toward a metaphysical realm or predilection towards things that don't change much, everything is changing in our world. It is just part of the way it works. So let's jump to the next one. And this is interesting because not in terms of things that can endure by being physically built out of something, but another way of things enduring over time. And art can do that. And, a culture endures through its art perhaps more than its artifacts. I'll explain that in a minute, but here you can see it with the myth of Gilgamesh. What gave Gilgamesh immortality was not cutting down the cedar forest, was not rebuilding the city of Uruk, because actually the city of Uruk was for thousands of years really lost, and it was only in the 19th century that it was rediscovered. So he didn't get a whole lot of immortality there, Gilgamesh. But this story has been alive and well for nearly 5,000 years. The story is what gave Gilgamesh immortality. We would not be talking about Gilgamesh in this class if we didn't have the artwork, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And even though we take an eco-critical approach, the Epic of Gilgamesh wouldn't be talked about, and Gilgamesh would not be talked about in many classes if we didn't have the Epic, what was written down here. And the reason is art can hold an image across time. It's representational. And notice our word present here. Remember, we had the absence and presence things. Representational is represent. It is the presence again. It is able to give us a representation, and that presence can endure over time. So the actual presence of Gilgamesh, if we were to see him in the flesh, that would have only lasted however long his life was. Probably not very long. I'm sure you may know this, but up until a few hundred years ago, the average lifespan of the average human being was not beyond 30. Some people did live longer. Infant mortality is an issue. People didn't live very long. So Gilgamesh's time, his presence, on Earth was not very great. But because he has been represented in this artwork, that presence, that representation, that represence has endured again for almost 5,000 years. So a good example of this, that Shakespeare is fully aware of this, by the way. Shakespeare is aware of a lot of things. In Sonnet 18, he has this famous, the sonnet you may know, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" So, and that's how it starts in the couplet that ends it. "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." So what is this that he's talking about here that gives life to thee? Well, that's Sonnet 18, the sonnet that he's written. So the notion here is that Shakespeare is talking about a beautiful young man, and he's at the height of his beauty, and Shakespeare is well aware of how beautiful this young man is, and is celebrating that beauty in the sonnet. And I'm going to give you the whole sonnet. And the idea is that that beauty will fade. It won't be long, a few decades, and that beauty's gone, and maybe even the young man is gone, certainly no longer a young man. But the sonnet has given him a kind of immortality. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. So as long as someone can read this, so long then this, and this gives life to thee. The sonnet has made him immortal. So we always, and it worked, right? Even the way we refer to this person, we don't know who exactly it was. There are theories, but we don't know who exactly it was, but it's the young man, right? He's been captured at this moment. It's like saying, it's like Shakespeare, if he wrote about like a rose, and we don't really know who the rose was, but the name would be the perfect rose, or the blooming rose. And the young man is the blooming rose. He is at that perfect moment. And language and art is able to do that. Paintings can do it as well. And certainly, marble and stone things can do it. And if you remember, when we had the Epic of Gilgamesh, I gave you a stone carving relief of Gilgamesh. So that's an attempt to do it as well. Art has that remarkable ability. But the interesting thing is, as long as the story keeps getting told and reproduced, in the sense that we get that representation, that represence, and we keep making it again and again, it could last a very long time. The Epic of Gilgamesh maybe will last 50,000 years. It will all depend how long we last as a culture, and we have obviously one of our greatest tests of whether we will endure as a species with the way that we've radically modified the environment, and especially the climate. So I'm not sure how long the Epic of Gilgamesh or Sonnet 18 will last, but clearly these have the ability to last for a very, very long time, arguably more than even something like the Great Pyramids, because they are still there, but they are not there in their previous brilliance, right? It's faded over time. Arguably, the Epic of Gilgamesh is there in all its shining glory, and certainly so is Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. There may be some issues here because you have to translate them into new languages, but if you have a good translator like Stephen Mitchell, our translator, then I think you really do get a great view of a great representation, or the presence of Gilgamesh lives on. But what would art be like if it didn't do that? And it's kind of interesting. It is interesting that in the West we don't have a whole lot of art like that. But Andy Goldsworthy's landscape art is a good example, and we're going to see this with Virgil, because such art is principally gestural. It gestures away from itself to the ever-changing realm of phusis. So what do I mean by that? Well, with, the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's meant to capture Gilgamesh, between the boards of a book, or in that case on stone tablets. And that's where it is. You're meant to look at the work itself. Well, Goldsworthy doesn't quite want you to do that. I mean, he wants you to look at the work. He wants you to look at the sort of serpentine ice sculptures, for example. But the subject there isn't the ice sculpture. I mean, it might seem like it is, but instead it's the fact that the ice sculpture is just there for a moment, that it is caught in the play of absence and presence, and is going to be absent very soon. And all his art then draws attention to that aspect of the world. It pulls us back. And in terms of our line here, where so much art is way up here and all, Goldsworthy is pulling us down. His art is pulling us down as an art of the physical, an art of change. And that is, trying to, I would argue, what Andy Goldsworthy is doing is trying to reclaim the original sense of nature. It's trying to make an art of nature. And you can say, well, other people have done that. They've made beautiful paintings of Yosemite that have, lasted for 100 or more years. But that's the point, they're trying to capture it and sort of make those moments immortal, that they'll, the painting will last a long time. John Muir certainly does wonderful representations, written representations of like his time in California and all, which is great, but it's trying to capture the beauty of that. And then people actually go back and use those texts to try to understand historically how things have changed. So Henry David Thoreau, because he so carefully documents Walden Pond in both his personal journal and then the journal as it's converted into Walden, the book that we read, people have recently gone back and said, well, how is climate changing? How are plants changing? What's migrating? What's going on? Since Thoreau is such a good chronicler of that, you can see how things have changed between his time and ours. So even though it's meant to sort of lock things in time, it just can't, because things are always changing. So Goldsworthy is basically giving himself up to that, saying, well, if change is the way it is, let's celebrate change. So that's art. Down here. So let's talk about language as similar to art in this regard. Plato realized that language is where culture's ideas exist over time. So remember, Plato has this realm of the Aedae. These are things that never change, like justice and beauty. Well, to him, this is in language. Language is what does that. So we're born into language, in that, when we're born, we take on a language, and that's how we understand the world. Plato argued that in those languages, that's where the immortal beauty, immortal justice stands. And that's why it's so important for the right people to have control of that, because if you have the wrong people making representations of something like justice, it can cause trouble. And Plato specifically doesn't want poets to be in that business, because according to him, poets don't have a very good understanding of true justice. So you really need what he calls a philosopher king, a philosopher to spend 35 or more years trying to understand justice. And those are the people that should be writing down what justice is, so that each new generation are born into a clear picture of justice, rather than a poet who might not have a very good idea of it. So, yeah, and as you may know, in Book 10 of the Republic, Plato very famously exiles all the poets from his Republic because he feels that they're not very useful. So true, languages change and even die, but they, again, in a human scale, endure far longer than human life, than the human body. And it's interesting that they work quite well for this as far as an enduring thing. So you can give many examples, but one we've been actually touching on and using throughout is Plato infused his word, eidos, with a meaning that lives on today, because that word, eidos, and you can see if you look at it here, and depending on how you inflect it, it's even more common, that becomes our word ideas. So what are ideas? Well, these are things that endure over time. We still may think, the idea of justice or beauty endures over time. That's because Plato infused it with that meaning. So language has a way of crossing generations. And in Plato's case, we're well over 2,000 years here, and his thinking is alive and well. So even though it may seem that, if you really want to make something that endures, carve it out of marble, as Plato realized, as the person or persons who made the Epic of Gilgamesh realized, as Shakespeare realized, words are where it's at, language is where it's at. And Shakespeare in particular, emerging in a time where print culture is really coming on strong, realized that this would allow things to really continue. So in other words, you don't have to worry about someone, scribes hand copying manuscripts and all the way it had been done traditionally, let alone in Gilgamesh's era where you had to actually carve them onto tablets. But rather, print culture meant that the ideas could be reprinted again and again and again and again over time and never change, because unless there was a problem with the reprint, which there usually isn't. So this was a way of things really enduring over time. So language is a particularly strong way if you're trying to create something that will endure over time. Yeah, this is a way into it. So without language, how does a culture endure? It's an interesting question. Cultures endure through material culture, things like we've talked about, like tools and artifacts. But it's arguably more than anything else, what makes a people is their shared language that, is present across many generations and many individuals. Language lives and reproduces. It's made new by artists and literature. So what I mean by here is that, what makes us a people, say in the United States, what makes us a people? Well, there are lots of, physical artifacts that, material culture, things the way we make food and the way we build our houses and all. But arguably what makes, Americans American is that we speak this, Americanized version of the English language. That's what unites us as a people. So language is incredibly powerful that way. And without language, if you think about it, if you were a human being, if you were thrown into, if you took, a number of human beings and raised them without language, without a culture, and they became very fascinated by this idea of what that would be like in the 18th century. What would that be like? Because without a language so that people could communicate practices, cultural practices and all, you'd pick up things by watching other people and all, but what makes a culture is language. So it's really very, very important, because otherwise you won't have a culture that endures over time through many generations. And that's why it's kind of hard to think about, a culture that isn't sort of based in language. So, modern technology. So this is back to Heidegger, or sometimes Nazi friend. I feel compelled always to say that with Heidegger, just to make clear his involvement with the Nazis during the 1930s. And it's been argued, I've argued that it is sort of integral to his thinking. But from our point of view, what we're talking about here today, we really have to take that up. I mean, it's good to know it, but it's not really that big of an issue here, although I think if you burrowed down in here, you'd get it. But to Heidegger, modern technology is this quest for constant presence. So what's his example? Well, it's the dam, right? So there had been a streaming stream, Heraclitus's example of change, here today, gone tomorrow during a drought, back in big time, the next day during a flood. But also, constant presence is not only when you convert that stream into a reservoir, but something like fossil fuels. And why are they constantly present? Well, they're there 24/7, 365 days a year for us to use, and we do use them. So I'm actually filming this at night, and I look pretty bright here. Oops, sorry. It's because I have two lights shining on me right now, and those are only made possible through this juncture technologically fossil fuels. That's why it's constantly present. If I wanted to work around that, and I often do, except it's a little loud in my neighborhood at night. I film during the day because I actually have four big windows around me, and I have an abundant natural light, solar energy with direct. But our culture doesn't often work that way. In other words, we don't and I'm a good example, so I'm guilty of this, as guilty of this as anyone. I don't just film this during the day. I want the ability to film it at night for my reasons. So I am using this sort of artificial light, and that can only be made by fossil fuels at the present time. That will change, right? Because we now have a large installed base of wind and solar, and in part, some of the electricity coming into my little room here is coming from hydroelectric power, which California has, and also geothermal. California has more geothermal than any other state. And in fact, if California were its own country, it would have more geothermal energy than any other country, including countries we may often think about with geothermal, like Iceland. But for the most part, fossil fuels are making this possible. So I have light constantly whenever I want it because of fossil fuels. We like that in a culture. We don't like having to wait around for the sun to come out to film something. And hey, I'm guilty of that too. All of the above, in some sense, this whole thing, whether it's a reservoir or fossil fuels or whatever, are in some sense like Plato's, ideas. These are things that endure over time. We're not in a position where we have to worry about the decay or things passing away or not being present. In other words, I could leave these lights on 24/7, and this room, even if I had closed all the windows and pulled down all my shades, would be totally bright. Light is constantly present. How is that possible? Because, we live on a planet that rotates away from the sun, and we're half in darkness, or kind of half all the time. How is it possible you have constant presence of light? Well, we've engineered that. We've gone to great lengths to engineer it because we're not happy with having the absence of light. So these are conveniences, I note, because they convene together the Earth's resources for our use. So, they're like the Platonic ideas, they're like Judeo-Christian God, because they're always present. They're without change. So that's modern technology. So, Heraclitus' stream is a play of absence and presence, right? You step in it, you take your foot out, you step in again. The stream that had been present before is now absent. So what would technology be like if it gave into this? Well, we're seeing that and have been seeing it for the last 50 years as an environmental intervention. So what I mean is something like the slow food movement. What's that about? Well, give another example of what would be up here would be like bananas, right? I think I've talked about this before. You can walk into a store 365 days a year and get a banana any day, because we bring them all over the world to be there so that your store has a constant presence of bananas. The slow food movement wants to pull away from that. And the idea here is, with the slow food movement, you only eat food that is local and in season. So right now, I'm filming this during the summer. We're still in the stone fruit season, so lots of peaches, plums out there, stone fruit in form of berries like cherries and all, which is great. But enjoy them for now, because they will be absent soon. In the slow food movement, you're not going to bring cherries all over the planet, so you always have them. You eat them now when we have them, and then they will go away. But that's okay, because apples and pears are going to be coming on the scene in the fall when they're big. In fact, I have 3 apple trees right out here, and they're all actually bearing fruit now, although none of them are quite ripe, but they will be. There are some green apples there that are looking pretty ripe. So slow food is a celebration of that. It's not trying to save. It's not trying to engineer a constant presence, but things are always shifting all the time. You can see something like solar energy. If you only use it when it's present, then that could work that way. But we don't really want to do that. We want battery technology to make sure it's available all the time. What I mean by that is, you could go ahead and just, do your heavy electricity use during times when the sun is present. So you could cook your food during the daytime. You wouldn't need a battery and all, because you have a lot of electricity with, your photovoltaics, solar cells, and then use the electricity then. But don't go cooking things when it's dark, because then you'd have to use a battery to make sure you have a constant presence. I don't think we're quite ready to think about that way, but maybe we should. Hannah Arendt, Heidegger's student, argues that this is wrong, that we've always looked for constant present. So let's jump to this in ancient technology. You can see how this is at play here too. In ancient technology, grain is just that, right? The grain that you could have over 2 or 3 years, you could store it. Egyptians were doing that. That doesn't put you in the seasonal slow food thing where you only get this food this time of year, that food that time of year. Yeah. But again, the Heidegger says this is all modern, but going back to our examples, ancient temples, things that are built out of stone that are made to endure over time, that's all seen as in Arendt's thinking, the propensity on the part of the West. So Heidegger might be right that modern technology is sort of what he calls the fruition of this thinking, but according to Arendt, it's been around all forever. And in biblical thinking, this is the result of the fall, right? Because there was no need for agriculture, there was no need to preserve things like grains and all, if the earth spontaneously always gave you just what you needed. Arendt, and it's in a rather mean mode, I think, on her part, argues that cultures that don't try to do this, that don't try to hold things over time, whether that's through like saving food or building buildings that last or, anything of that sort, they're not quite human in her way of thinking. It's only laboring humans that do this. Otherwise, I'm sorry, when humans don't do this, they're like laboring animals. It's what we do. So, but every locus hominis is imagined this way, as being caught up in nature. But when we shifted away from that, like after the fall and all, suddenly we had a problem because we no longer had the earth taking care of us in that way. So, yeah. So that's the basic idea here, is that dualism has existed throughout the West. It is a central characteristic of Western philosophy, ideology, and culture. And it's important to think about because it postures how we think about nature and the world in which we are in. And again, the central message there has been throughout history that, it's an inferior thing, that it is not, the real thing, the real deal, whether it's heaven or Plato's realm or whatever. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind because it sort of shifts human attention away from the earth and sees the earth as unimportant and presumably maybe not worth taking care of as much. And we're gonna tease that out as we go further along. But I did want to sort of lay all this out first so we had a pretty clear understanding of how it works. So we're going to continue with early Greek thinking in the next class in a somewhat different way. So I'll see you then, and take care.